Hi, I'm Catherine Jean Lopez from the National Review Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this conversation with Father Peter John Cameron, Dominican priest and preacher and author, and good friend of mine. And we've done a series of these off and on, and we were talking a couple of weeks ago on the phone and thought that it would be good to talk about a gospel response to these turbulent times where there's so much anxiety and chaos and anger and confusion and total complete irrationality. But I don't need to tell you about any of that. So Father Peter, can you join here and talk a little bit about the need for reality, living in reality, acknowledging reality, because that's kind of at the core, the root of a lot of our trouble right now, isn't it?
Hello, Catherine. Thanks for having me. It's a joy to be with you, as always. I think what you are addressing is really at the heart of many people's lives and also their worries and their concerns. I mean, ever since 2020, we have almost felt abandoned and betrayed. And we can even think that we've been betrayed by reality itself. Between the onset of this pandemic and then all of the civil unrest and riots that were spawned by the murder of George Floyd and so many other things that have happened in the world, there is a sense that civilization is just unraveling, and that culture as we have known it up to now is simply dissolving, and to say it's fraying at the edges isn't enough, and it leaves us with this sense of powerlessness, but also of, as I say, a feeling of abandon, like we're done in by life itself. And if that's the case, then how can we find the wherewithal even to face the next 5 minutes? But so we need some perspective on what's happening and what is going on around us, so that we can make sense of it. But more than that, so that we can live with certainty and conviction, because it's the only way to live in the midst of just turbulence that seems to be unending. And I think part of it has to do with being realistic about reality, seeing what's happening around us and presuming that the chaos, the anarchy, the disease, all of that has the last word, is probably not the most realistic way of facing reality. Do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And when you say people feel betrayed, they feel betrayed by God.
Yeah.
And even before the pandemic, I remember in response to some shooting, the New York Daily News had on its cover, "God's not listening," because mocking sort of the thoughts and prayers that people will tweet at such a time. And there is a real sense that, and this is nothing new under the sun. When there's suffering, we tend to think that means that we're being punished or that there shouldn't be suffering. But anyone who's read the Bible knows there's suffering. And anyone who looks at the cross, we're not acknowledging reality of the Christian faith if we're not acknowledging that Christ himself suffered.
In fact, ever since all of this started, one of my go-to sort of meditation passages is in the Gospel of Matthew 24, where Jesus speaks very candidly and almost sort of scarily about what we are to expect in the future. So he says, "You will hear of wars and reports of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for these things must happen, but it will not yet be the end. Nation will rise against nation." And as we continue to pray for the atrocity that's happening in Ukraine, we can't help but to think that's being referenced here. And kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes from place to place. All these are the beginning of the labor pains. Then they will hand you over to persecution, and they will kill you. Then you will be hated by all nations because of my name. And then many will be led into sin. They will betray and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and deceive many. And because of the increase of evil doing, the love of many will grow cold. I think that's one of the most shocking things that Jesus says in any of the Gospels. But the one who perseveres to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. So we want to be people of that perseverance, but it begins by, I think, being realistic about reality, that things have changed. So the old conventions and the principles that so many of us were brought up on now have been trashed to a large extent, but that doesn't mean that we have been orphaned. That in fact, we're being called to an even deeper level of integrity and of virtue living, and Christ himself prepares us for it.
You pointed out to me a couple of months ago that Father Pincares writes about spiritual martyrdom, and he talks about the Beatitudes as our toolkit for combating spiritual battle. And that's just sort of mind-blowing when you realize, Christ on the Sermon on the Mount gave us everything that we need in order to live in the world as we fear it, really. And there's nothing to fear because if this has all been set out for us. And if we live by faith, we know that all suffering is redeemed. And the question is, do we actually believe this? And that is the big question that the pandemic and so many of these other things really force us to confront. Do we believe it or not?
I think a key aspect of being realistic about reality is calling to mind that the Son of God himself never promised a life of luxury, of lack of war, of a strifeless life. In fact, it's just the opposite that he told us that we have to be on the alert for, that things would fall apart, that the world apart from God would itself begin to disintegrate. And that's what we're seeing. But I think sometimes people do the bad math of thinking that if there is a God and God is love, then the world should not be like this. But even the great St. Paul, who at the very moment of his calling was told by Jesus Christ that he would have to suffer. I mean, that was part and parcel of the whole package that the Lord presented to Paul, writes in his second letter to Timothy, do not forget this. There will be terrible days, terrible times in the last days. Men will be lovers of self and of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, profane, inhuman, implacable, slanderous, licentious, brutal, hating the good. They will be treacherous, reckless, pompous, lovers of pleasure rather than of God, and they make a pretense of religion, but negate its power. For the time will come when people will not tolerate sound doctrine, but following their own desires, will surround themselves with teachers who tickle their ears. They will stop listening to the truth and will wander off to fables. So if we listen to this inspired word of God, we have the first entree into the peace of the gospel, because we know that there's nothing that can befall us that God hasn't already foreseen, warned us about, and assured us is not a sign of the end, but of his abandoning us, but rather it is the path to an even more secure and holier and happier life in God.
I was super consoled rereading a part of Romans talking about St. Paul where he says, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is yet to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God, for the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the glorious liberty of the children of God. He goes on to say, for in this hope we were saved. Now, hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. I just think that's so crucial to be reminded of again and again, because we look for signs that we don't need. And we have to have this faith that there's something more. And if we're looking for it all now, and if we're despairing because of all of the litany of things you just read from Paul to Timothy, then we're not living by faith. We're wanting some kind of magic, something
Yes.
that we're not meant to live by.
And we're going to get to faith, but we're going to do it in a very sort of systematic way, because if we realize that the true reality is not all of the chaos and the corruption that we see around us, but that is pointing us to what is the truest lasting truth, then that is a cause for changing our behavior and changing the way, what we dedicate ourselves to, what we're devoted to. And so we want to be obedient in front of reality. We want to be realistic about reality, as we say, and to bring up hope is absolutely right. I mean, one person who's helped me very much in these days to kind of make sense of all of the squalor of the situation is the 20th century Catholic writer George Bernanos. And he loves to talk about hope. He was kind of a scrappy guy, but he was a person who was indefatigable in his belief in God. And he says, to hope, it's not something sentimental or something that's just going on inside us in some sort of an emotional way. He says, to hope is to confront. So we're going to look at whatever is going on around us, and we're not going to presume that it has the upper hand or that it's won, but that rather there is more to be revealed, and it can be revealed only through the truth, who is Jesus himself. And so, and in fact, we need the experience of the desperation that all of these circumstances provokes in us, precisely to be brought to the point that we become real people of hope and not just sort of quasi-hopers. I mean, von Balthasar says the highest form of hope is despair that has been overcome. And so maybe we need to be pushed to almost the moment of despair in terms of everything. And, you know, I don't want to bring up all the bad news because it's very clear to us, but it can make us feel sort of desperate. It's something Bernanos says in one of his writings. He says, every predestined person at least once in his life thought he was sinking and hitting rock bottom. And that's many of us right now. The illusion that everything has been taken from us, at the same time, the feeling of total dispossession is the divine sign, on the contrary, that everything is only now beginning. And I think he's right.
We're going to talk about witness a little later on, more in depth, but what you were just saying about our need to encounter our poverty, because we don't know that we need God until we do that. I was reading something from St. Ambrose where he says, you're a daily witness to Christ. You are a martyr for Christ if you suffer the temptation of the spirit of lust, but fearful of the future judgment of Christ. You have not thought about profaning the purity of soul and body. He goes on and says, you are a martyr for Christ if you were tempted by the spirit of avarice to confiscate the goods of those below you, or not to respect the rights of the defenseless widows. But you judged that it was better to achieve riches through the contemplation of divine precepts than to commit an injustice. He says, you are a martyr for Christ if you suffer the temptation of the spirit of pride. But seeing yourself weak and helpless, you turn with a pious spirit and you love humility more than arrogance. And he goes on, the point being that saints are not people who have no temptations, who are perfect. No, they're people who know that they're weak and that they need God alone and completely.
And part of this being realistic about reality has to do with, I guess, the temptation to want to actually do battle with evil directly, and there's something to that, because we want to be valiant, and the saints truly were valiant, but there's also a false valiance valor that can actually lead to worse consequences. And again, Bernano's here, he has one of his characters and one of his novels say, I don't rise up in revolt against evil, because God himself did not rise in revolt against it. Rather, and he's talking about Jesus Christ on the cross, rather he says, he assumed it. I don't even curse the devil. But this takes a tremendous certainty about the existence of God and the reality of God's divine providence in order not to give into an impulse that will only make a disintegrating situation even worse.
It's the danger of confusing yourself for the Savior, and thinking that you need to do more than you're being asked to do, which is a really, I think it's a particularly American temptation, because we talk about self-reliance in our culture, which is one of my chief sins, and I'm probably not alone.
Yeah. No, I mean, and the whole notion of, well, if God is real and if his divine providence is real, how can he create a world that would allow this kind of evil to be so rampant and to be so ravaging? And it's a huge question. I found some consolation in a philosopher of religion, a Polish philosopher by the name of Lelek Kolakowski, who wrote a very interesting book called Religion If There Is No God. And I don't know how much of a believer he was, which makes his judgment on this even that much more interesting and perhaps credible. And he's commenting on the philosopher Leibniz, and he says, when God created the world, God had to find out which combination of logically compatible qualities would yield the optimum good. Instead of free human subjects, God could have produced creatures who were incapable of sinning, but only at the price of depriving them of their free will, which inevitably includes both the possibility of sin and actual acts of sinning. And then he makes this very astonishing point. He says, and he computed that a world inhabited by sinless automata would produce significantly less good than one containing human beings who have freedom of choice and therefore might often prefer evil. Wow. So what he's saying is, by creating human beings with the possibility of doing evil, when they refuse to do evil, they're not and opt to do something good in its place, they're accomplishing two things at once. And so the whole notion of sacrifice and heroism really would not be possible except in this particular kind of equation that God brings about in creating human beings capable of sin.
Interesting you mentioned sacrifice. I read a quote from Father Chiswick, who was Walter Chiswick, the Jesuit, who was imprisoned by the Soviets for 23 years. He said, during his incarceration, day by day, I learned to experience in some measure the power of God as manifested in the mystery of the Passion. Pain and suffering comprised the sacrifice needed in the passion for saving souls. A similar sacrifice had to be undertaken by all those called to the apostolate. And yet the suffering and sacrifice were touched by deep spiritual joy, because in them one saw God's will accomplished in an otherwise frustrating life, the great work of salvation promoted. If you look upon sacrifice and suffering only through the eyes of reason alone, your tendency will be to avoid as much of it as you can, for pain in itself is never pleasant. But if you can learn to see the role of pain and suffering in relation to God's redemptive plan for the universe and each individual soul, your attitude must change. You don't shun it when it comes upon you, but bear it in the measure grace is given you. You see it in a putting on of Christ in the true sense of the word. Out of this insight comes joy and an increased hope. Out of it too grows compassion for others and a hope that they also may be helped to understand the true meaning of life and its trials, its joys and its sufferings. Fired with this enthusiasm, the soul constantly yearned to communicate the wonders of God's grace to everyone. This isn't a man who's just sitting at his desk writing. This is a man suffering, living, preaching as he lives.
And he's a realist. And it's the truest form of realism, because there's the suffering. Who would fault him if his suffering caused him to become cynical or sarcastic or just hopeless? But instead, it's
bitter.
Precisely,
or bitter, as we
often
do.
Yeah, but it's precisely what fires him to discover the truth of reality. And that is precisely what I think this experience of upheaval is really forcing us to do. I mean, it's expressed in a enigmatic way in the Gospel of John, when Jesus is being put to his passion by Pontius Pilate. When he says to Jesus, "What is truth?" And sometimes we read that and we just immediately presume that Pontius Pilate's question to our Lord is cynical. What is truth? There's no such thing as truth. But the reality, if you read that gospel closely, is that this man is the only one in the entire Gospel of John who announces publicly that Jesus Christ is the King. This man is the one who brings Jesus Christ before the world and says, "Behold the man." And who is the man? Well, the man represents Adam. That is to say, the humanity that God brought into the world precisely so that there would be a creature that would image him, love him, and share in his own life. And Pontius Pilate, by putting Jesus Christ in front of the people and identifying him in that way, is saying, you want to kill this humanity in favor of a barbaric one, that an inhumanity that you have now made your idol. And also, it is Pontius Pilate who had a sign put on the cross of Jesus Christ that read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews," proclaiming him to be a king. And it is the only thing that we know of from the time of Christ that was ever written about him. And it was written by this man. So maybe his question wasn't a cynical one. Maybe he realized that in this chaos and in this in this anarchy that was being wrought by people that could not stand the truth, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," in the exceptional humanity of Jesus Christ, as it came in front of him, he realized, no, the most realistic way of facing reality was getting to the heart of this truth, who is this man. And it's something that we have to do.
Every Holy Week, I kind of approach as an indictment, because this isn't a story that happened in the past. This is Pontius Pilate kind of saying to all of us, like, you say he's king, but you're not living as though he's king. That's the message I take from it all the time. And I was reading something from Thomas Merton's book on contemplation. And I mention this because sometimes, as Chiswick was saying, if you run from pain if you don't see the meaning in it. And even those of us who profess to be Christian, we're oftentimes practical atheists who don't appreciate that we are. John Paul II and Benedict talked about that, the widespread practical atheism among Christians. And Merton said, the theology of the devil is not really theology, but magic. Faith in this theology is really not the acceptance of a God who reveals himself as mercy. It's a psychological subjective force which applies a kind of violence to reality in order to change it according to one's own whims. Faith is a kind of super effective wishing in this thinking, a mastery that comes from a special, mysteriously dynamic willpower that is generated by profound convictions. By virtue of this wonderful energy, one can exert a persuasive force even on God himself and bend his will to one's own will. By this astounding new dynamic, soul force of faith, which any quack can develop in you for an appropriate remuneration, you can turn God into a means to your own ends. So we go on with this until we become disgusted with the whole business. We get tired of generating soul force. We get tired of this faith that does not do anything to change reality. It does not take away our anxieties or conflicts. It leaves us prey to uncertainty. It does not lift all our responsibilities off our shoulders. Its magic is not so effective after all. And that I think of so many of the banners people hide behind to try to find some kind of meaning or purpose or to try to change reality. And it leads, as you were indicating earlier, to riots and violence, and including violence on the human person. That's what so much of abortion and sexual ideologies and things are about. It's a violence against reality, and it's a violence against the human person and everything that we're made to be. It's a kind of enslavement. I was reading, we talked late last year about Father Alfred Delp, another Jesuit who was incarcerated by the Nazis, who was killed by the Nazis. And he talks about how when you deny the reality of God, you start just falling into the spiral of slavery, because you're in bondage to every new idea there is, as Merton was suggesting, and you have to latch on to these values that are in place of God, basically.
The bottom line, really, in trying to reclaim a sanity in the midst of a world that has gone mad, it has to begin with prayerfully and calmly asking the question, is there truth? And as Pilate puts, what is truth? Because Cardinal Ratzinger always warned us about the tyranny of relativism. And this is something that Bernanos also takes up. Now, he can be very blunt, but I think there's something apt about his bluntness. So in one passage, he says, the world is filled with the wrath of the imbeciles. He says what rattles them in their wrath is the idea of redemption. For this at bottom is the hope of all, it is the origin of all human hope. Imbeciles will fight tooth and nail to the bitter end for the conception of the world, society, and life that dispenses them from having to judge and choose. And what then? I'll gladly tell you. The imbeciles' fury will fill the world, and Pharisaical civilization, monstrous daughter of an aborted Christianity, will have fulfilled its destiny. And I think we're experiencing this. I mean, there are Christians, many Christians, have to each day ask themselves, what is the truth? What do I hold to be the truth about life itself? What do I hold to be the truth about sexual love? What do I hold to be the truth about biological existence, gender identity, so-called. I mean, we have to have a certainty about all these issues that are being flayed in our midst before we can begin to respond to them in a way that is adequate to healing those who have been duped by them and have become lost as a result of a mentality that has embraced an insanity, and as you call it, a practical atheism.
I should point out that we have about 15 minutes left, and if you have any questions, if you're watching this live, you can put it in the chat box, and we'll try to address them. Instead of imbeciles, I like to think of the walking wounded, because that's so much of what we're seeing. As you said, people are duped by all of these lies, and you've heard me talk about this before. Increasingly in New York City, if you participate in a prayer vigil for life outside an abortion clinic, it's subject to some violence and a lot of intimidation and actual human blockades, and obviously really crude words and things. But as people are swearing at you and using their finger in inappropriate ways and all the other things they're doing, I just look at in some of these people's eyes, and there's so much obvious pain. There was one time last November where an event I was doing was protested, and afterward, a sister of life and I went up to the woman who kind of interrupted the whole program and just thanked her for coming, and spending the time and having that respect. And her response to Sister John Mary was "F you," and a couple of times, and you just your heart breaks for her, because what happened in her life that she in front of a smiling sister of life who is so present to her and loving her, trying to give her the gaze of God the Father, and truly doing that, to have that response, it's just we should be basically doing penance with our lives for that which the church hasn't communicated in recent decades. I think in particular about the issues you just brought up, and how much opposition there was to Humanae Vitae, which Paul VI was so prophetic in talking about how men and women would be against one another, and all that would happen to humanity. And there was opposition in the Catholic Church to it, so it wasn't communicated as it could have been, and so whenever I'm in a situation like that, I feel like I'm doing penance, and I just want to do and be a beacon of love in whatever way I can, and sometimes that's just by prayer and by not responding in kind, but we really have to be gratuitous in our love and compassion in the midst of being confident in reality, and that everything that Christ says is true.
Perhaps the most powerful event in that story that you told, Catherine, is that once this young person lashed out at you and the sister, you didn't return it in kind, nor did you wilt. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
I'm sure you both were there, smiling and peaceful.
Yeah.
And that, even though you're not going to see the fruit of that, I'm sure that went very deep in that person, because no matter how vociferous and actually hostile a person might be, all of us have to live, or we're all looking for a destiny, and we cannot make our own destiny. I mean, I know you've heard me say before, this is the one thing about the Forrest Gump movie that drives me crazy. When Mrs. Gump tells her son, you make your own destiny. And a lot of people try to do that, and they are so bankrupt when they are successful in pursuing it, and they realize there's no destination to their destiny. It's the worst kind of forsakenness and of being abandoned. So the reality is that yes, the actions of people can be terrible, but that's not what we look at first and foremost. We see the gift of the person they are, and the dignity that they are as persons, and we love that no matter how much they're angry and spouting and even trying to kill us, like Jesus on the cross begging for forgiveness. And it's in that we can help people come to the truth of who they are and what they're called to in life. This is servant of God, Monsignor Luigi Giussani, who says, we need to have the courage of the truth in ourselves. This means the awareness that desperation is a lie. Desperation must first be conquered in ourselves. Well, how do we do that? He says, this comes only from the rebirth of the self. You cannot avoid destiny. Destiny is greater than you. And in fact, you did not exist and then you were born. Therefore, you are within something greater than what is hurting you, than what is persecuting you, than what is withering you. And what constitutes you, your destiny, has the ability to raise you up if you only desire it, if you only accept it. And your response before that young woman is what gave that person a chance to experience, yes, there's a destiny that constitutes me, that's greater than my anger and all of my outrage. And I want it to arise in me. I want to accept it. I want to accede to it. And that's why the only thing that is adequate to what is ransacking the world is a Christian living by his or her faith.
What was striking to me about that particular incident, too, was we were talking about the rights of women. Erica Bakioki has a magisterial new book where she talks about the suffragettes, among other things, who were against abortion, and so when she kind of this woman kind of disrupted the program, she was declaring that she loves sex. And nothing we had talked about would have suggested that we think that this is evil or anything. And it strikes me as you were talking, it is about an inability to accept reality, because she couldn't even receive what was being presented. There is this preconceived, the church hates, kind of presumption mindset, something she had bought into. And yeah, the only response to that is love.
Yeah. Again, this is Bernanos. He says, modern man is man in anguish. He says, anguish has taken the place of faith. And it's only the Christian that understands, yeah, there's going to be anguish in my life, but it does not displace God. In fact, it's anguish that gives me the certainty of God's power. And it's precisely the reason why Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity, is born into the world, is to show us, as to give us a strength that outdistances anguish, and at the same time enables us to reconfigure it into something good. But faith is not just something intellectual, and faith involves, it's like a moral conviction that we make toward all of reality. For me, one of the most profound expressions of this was by the 18th century Jesuit spiritual master Jean-Pierre de Caussade. And he says, what God arranges for us to experience at each moment is the best and holiest thing that could happen to us. So even if right now my life is in total disarray, our faith is never more alive than when what we experience through our senses contradicts and tries to destroy it. The life of faith is the untiring pursuit of God through all that disguises and disfigures him, and, as it were, destroys and annihilates him. You are seeking for secret ways of belonging to God, but there's only one: making use of whatever he offers you. Everything leads you to this union with him. And so if anguish comes, that is the moment to stand within the gaze of Jesus Christ and to recognize this presence that changes us and that shows us that that love is greater than hate, and to allow that love to love and remold us.
And these aren't merely pious words. Last night I hosted Archbishop Bashar Warda from Erbil, Iraq, in National Review Institute's office, and he's such a beacon of the truth of Christ. He's a holy sort of, you wouldn't know walking into the room, that he was such a courageous leader necessarily. He's just a kind, humble man. But I got to know him when all of these people had to flee Mosul because of the ISIS genocide, and he managed, with the help of the Knights of Columbus and others, to build a Catholic university there during the course of this, because he needed to show that there was a future there for Christians who might be inclined to leave. A lot of them did, to flee for safety. But one of the things that I find so inspiring and so humbling, so often when I talk to Christians from that part of the world, is how there's actually a gratitude. First of all, a gratitude for anyone who cares to listen to their story and know they exist, but a gratitude that they know what's most important in life, that Jesus Christ is most important. And so then there's a fearlessness, not a pompous, or, there's a humble confidence in the truth of the reality of the Christian faith, that just, it leaves room for the Holy Spirit to guide life in ways that those of us who are sort of distracted by false security in the world, we don't have as clear a grasp on very often.
And at the same time, then when problems and even catastrophes befall us, it's not an occasion for despair and capitulating to some sense of being betrayed, but rather it pushes us with greater certitude into divine providence, and those are human arms, certain that even these things that are so impossible to make sense out of according to worldly standards will add up to a great wisdom, precisely because we have opted for the only appropriate way of looking at reality in a realistic way. I mean, von Balthasar used to say, only where a man understands himself by reference to God are human dignity and culture possible. And why is that? Because faith is a way of knowing. When we believe in God and when we profess faith in him, which we do every time we recite the creed, God gives us the ability to know and to understand that as a sharing in his own knowledge. It is a grace of being blessed in a certain respect with his own mind. And therefore there's nothing, no matter how calamitous, that can undermine us. Rather, those very occasions are the cause and the impetus for us to deepen our belief. Renano said once, when he was listening to a discourse by Adolf Hitler, he said, when we've reached a point of such confusion, the only thing we really still have to oppose him with is the faith of children, the patience of the poor, all those things we lack, but which the good Lord will surely give us. And he really will.
We have to end in a moment, but I was rereading our friend Father Romano Cesario's book on St. Catherine and the Passion, Compassionate Blood. And he talks about how Catherine loves the cross of Christ. As you know well, so many of her letters begin in the name of Jesus Christ crucified, constantly reminding herself and others. But he talks about how we recognize that the cross of Christ stands at the center of the universe, and that God never destroys the creatures that he's made, to whom he has given the borrowed existence of human life. it has to change everything. And I think these times are a really constant reminder with nearly every headline that this is true, and we need to pray for the grace to live as if we really believe it,
and to live it radically,
with courage, the kind of courage that only comes in true trust in God.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Father Peter John Cameron.
Thank you, Catherine.
So good to do this once again. And thank you everyone for joining us here at the National Review Institute, and either live or after the fact on YouTube. Please feel free to share this and check out the National Review Institute's website for upcoming events like this. Thank you very much.